The Galactic Council mocked Earth then. One human pressed a button. Part 1, the invitation nobody expected. The seat was too tall for me. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the assembly chamber of the Meridian Conclave. Every seat at the curved council table had been designed for a species that was either taller, wider, or structured so differently from a human being that the furniture looked less like furniture and more like a warning. I pulled myself up onto the chair, adjusted my earpiece, and tried to look like I belonged there. I almost certainly did not. My name is Yara Asa. I was 39 years old, born in Accra, raised partly London, and I had spent the last 15 years of my career studying alien communication patterns from a research station on the moon. I had a doctorate in xenolinguistics and a secondary degree in diplomatic protocol that I had earned through distance program while working night shifts. I had never been to space before. This assignment, the journey from Earth to the Meridian Conclave, had taken 11 days aboard a repurposed cargo hauler called the Old Gut, and I had spent most of it reading briefing documents and trying not to think about the size of the universe pressing against the windows. Earth had been granted observer status in the Galactic Council 4 months earlier. It was the lowest possible rank. It meant we could watch. It meant we could listen. It meant we could not vote, could not speak on the floor without explicit permission, and could not participate in any closed session. The letter of invitation, translated into 17 Earth languages by the Council's automated relay system, had described observer status as an opportunity for developing civilizations to learn from more established galactic communities. That was one way to put it. I had been appointed as Earth's first delegate by the Secretary General herself in a meeting that lasted 20 minutes and involved very little ceremony. She had shaken my hand, given me a black briefing packet with a classification level I had never seen before, and told me one thing before I left: listen more than you speak. I had nodded and taken the packet, and I had not opened it because I could read a situation, and the situation was that whatever was inside that packet was not something I was supposed to need. The Meridian Conclave was a ring station, enormous and slowly rotating to generate gravity, positioned at a gravitationally neutral point between 3 star systems. It housed permanent delegations from 44 species. The architecture shifted every few hundred meters to accommodate the biological needs of whoever lived in that section. My quarters were in Section 14, a human standard environment with breathable air and something that was approximately a bed. The hallway outside smelled faintly of something sweet that I could never identify. I had arrived during the opening assembly of the Council's 462nd session. I had been directed to the observer gallery, a raised section at the back of the main chamber, separated from the primary floor by a low transparent barrier. There were 2 other observer delegations present that session. Group of 4 grayscaled beings from a world called Tush, whose name I could not pronounce, and a single small creature from somewhere near the outer rim that seemed to communicate entirely through color changes in its skin. We sat in the back together, none of us speaking, watching 44 civilizations begin the formal business of running a galaxy. The Valhari were the first species I Notice because they were impossible not to notice, tall and crystalline there. Bodies catching and bending the light in ways that made them look like they were slightly on fire at all times. They had been a spacefaring civilization for over 6,000 years. Their senior representative was a being named Ruxful, ancient even by Valhari standards, who moved with the careful slowness of something that had learned long ago there was no reason to rush. The Cathar were smaller and faster, insected in structure with compound eyes that processed visual information across a broader spectrum than human eyes could. They spoke quickly in a clicking, layered language that my earpiece translated with a half-second delay. I caught one of their junior diplomats glancing at me during the preliminary address and saying something to the delegate beside him. My earpiece translated it as, "The human appears to be precognitive, interesting choice of representative." I kept my expression neutral. I had been warned this might happen. The Darren were harder to categorize. Species of distributed gas entities. They moved through the chamber in soft, drifting clouds collecting in their designated area like weather systems. With opinions, their formal address came through speaker embedded in the council table. Since they did not have mouths in any conventional sense, they were the ones who asked during the brief observer introductions whether Earth had yet achieved basic stellar manipulation. I said no, we had not. There was a sound in the chamber then that I can only describe as polite amusement, not laughter exactly, like the collective exhale of 44 civilizations who had just confirmed something they already suspected. After the session, as the delegates moved toward their respective common areas, Ruxful approached me. He was very tall up close. His crystalline structure caught the light from a different angle at this distance, and I had to work to maintain eye contact because looking directly at him felt like looking at a refraction rather than a being. He said, "You are Earth's delegate." I said, "I am." He said, "We have observed your world for some time. You are an interesting case." I said, "Thank you." He said it was not a compliment, it was an observation. "You burn, Dr. Asa. Your civilization burns very quickly and very hot. We have seen that pattern before." I waited. He said, "You are here so that your species may observe how civilizations are meant to operate. We expect nothing more from this visit. We hope it will be educational for you." He moved away before I could respond. I watched him go. I thought about the word educational. I thought about the word expect. That night I sat in my quarters and pulled out the black briefing packet. I looked at the classification label. The front, I put it back in my bag without opening it. I was not ready yet, but I was starting to understand that I would need to be. The seat was too tall for me, but I was in it, and I was not going anywhere. Part 2, What They Think We Are. The council's second session began with an administrative dispute about light frequency allocations in a contested star corridor and lasted 4 hours. I sat in the observer gallery and took notes on a small device that the security protocol required me to declare at entry each morning. The Cathar delegate spent most of the session visibly impatient. The Valhari elder Ruxful said almost nothing and somehow still managed to be the most influential presence in the room. I had been on the conclave for 3 weeks when I started to understand the deeper Structure of the place, not the official structure. I had memorized that from the briefing documents on the old. Who deferred to whom, which alliances were old and which were manufactured. Which species said one thing in the chamber and arranged different things in the corridors outside. The council had a problem that none of its official documents acknowledged. It had been running for approximately 8,000 years. In that time it had expanded, cut a feud, regulated and organized. It had developed procedures for nearly every conceivable scenario. It had. The process also stopped changing. Valhari had not introduced a new piece of legislation in 600 years. The Darren had not altered their core position on any significant issue in over a millennium. The entire institution had the particular quality of something that had been preserved so carefully it had begun to calcify. I was not supposed to notice this. I was a precognitive species from a world that had only had spaceflight for 180 years, but I had spent 15 years studying how beings communicate, and the first thing you learn in xenolinguistics is that what is not said is often more important than what is. What was not being said in the corridors and common areas and during the quiet recesses between sessions was that the council was afraid. Not of me specifically, not of Earth. Not yet. They were afraid of the pattern. We represented a civilization that had developed from ground-level technology to interstellar travel in less than 2 centuries, that had survived disease, resource exhaustion, internal conflict, and the near collapse of its own climate, and had emerged from each crisis not just intact, but accelerated. We were not, in the Council's framework, a normal trajectory. Esasitica found me on the 14th day, during a recess in the 3rd session. She was Keth, young for her species, only 40 years old, which among the Keth put her somewhere between a junior diplomat and a graduate student. Her compound eyes were a shade of amber that shifted toward green in certain light, and she moved with the fast, precise energy that I had come to associate with her species. She sat down beside me in the observer gallery with the casual confidence of someone who had decided that social conventions were optional. She said, "You are the human." I said, "I am one of them, yes." She said, "How long have you had faster than light travel?" I said, "Commercially available about 60 years. The first successful test was roughly 80 years ago." She went very still. Among the Keth, stillness was significant. It meant they were processing something they had not anticipated. She said, "And you are already here." I said, "That appears to be the case." She looked at me for a moment with her shifting amber-green eyes and said, "Most species take between 300 and 500 years between first successful interstellar transit and council contact. Some take longer." I said, "We had some motivation to move faster." She said, "What motivation?" I said, "We almost did not survive. Several times, when you almost do not survive enough times, you develop a certain sense of urgency." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to understand that better." I said, "I would like that too." That was the beginning of the only genuine friendship I made on the conclave. Esasitica was curious in a way that most of the other delegates were not. She was not curious because she was trying to assess a risk or file a report. She was curious because she genuinely wanted to understand things she did not already know. That quality was rarer than I had expected, even among beings who had been traveling the stars for generations. It was Essissitica who told me, 11 days after we first spoke about the closed session. I had been excluded from it as observer. Delegates routinely were. The official record described it as an administrative efficiency review. Essissitica told me quietly on the edge of the common area where the background sound of a dozen alien conversations would make it difficult for anyone to monitor our specifically what it had actually been about. It had been a vote on Earth's classification status. The Council maintained a tiered classification system for civilizations. At various stages of development, most of the categories were benign. They affected things like communication, protocols, and trade access, but Category 3 was different. Category 3 was described in the Council's own documentation as protective, developmental guidance for civilizations, demonstrating accelerated or unstable growth patterns. In practice, it meant managed restriction. A Category 3 classification would give the Council the authority to limit what technologies Earth could access, to decide how fast we were allowed to advance, to set boundaries on our expansion, our research, our contact with other species. All of it justified in the Council's language as protection for us and for everyone else. The vote had passed. I sat with that information for a long time. I did not let my expression change, because I was in a public space and I had enough training to know that my reaction would be observed. But underneath that stillness, something was happening that I can only describe as a cold, clear, absolute refusal. Rixville came to see me the following afternoon. He said the Council had decided to notify me formally as a courtesy, given my observer status. He explained the classification. He used the word protection several times. He said the last species that had developed this rapidly had caused damage across 3 sectors when their civilization collapsed under the weight of its own speed. He said the Council's responsibility was to prevent that kind of outcome. I asked him the name of that species. He said they no longer have a name. That is rather the point. I looked at him. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about what it meant to remove someone's name. I thought about how many times humans had come close to removing their own. I said, how long before the vote is ratified? He said 90 days. I said, thank you for telling me. He left. I sent an encrypted transmission to Earth. I was as precise as I knew how to be. I told them what the classification meant. I told them what the timeline was. I told them that the Council did not consider us a threat exactly. It considered us a variable they wanted to control before we became one. The response came back in 6 hours. It was from the Secretary General. It was 4 words. Open the packet, Yara. I went to my quarters. I took the black briefing packet out of my bag. I cut the seal. I read it from beginning to end without stopping. When I finished, I sat in the narrow chair by the narrow window, looking out at the stars, and I did not move for a long time. Then I picked up my notes and started to work. I had 90 days to find a way to change the mind of a Council that had not changed its mind about anything significant in 600 years. I had no vote, no formal standing, and no guarantee that anyone would listen to me at all. What I had was everything humans have. Always had when the odds were completely against us, the absolute inability to accept that the situation could not be changed. That and whatever was in the packet. It turned out to be enough to start. Part 3, the case for humanity. I submitted the formal request for a hearing of reconsideration on the 30th day after the vote. The process for submitting such a request was buried in Volume 17, the Council's Procedural Manual, in a section that had not been cited in any official record for approximately 400 years. It required a formal petition signed by the delegate seeking reconsideration, statement of grounds, and a declaration that the petitioning party accepted full responsibility for any procedural consequences arising from the request. I signed all 3 documents in my own handwriting because the Council's Protocol Office had told me that species without standard digital signature infrastructure could use physical inscription. I used the pen I had brought from Earth. A simple black ballpoint. I thought my grandmother would have found that funny. The petition caused a reaction I had not fully anticipated. By the following morning, 3 different delegates had requested copies of the filing through official channels, a thing they were permitted to do under public record provisions, but which, according to Historias, essentially never happened. A Keth Information Service ran a brief item on it. The Duran released a statement describing the appeal as a notable procedural curiosity. Rixville said nothing, at least not publicly, but I noticed that he watched me more carefully during the next session. The Council granted the hearing. It was scheduled for 30 days out, I was told by the Protocol Office in a tone that managed to be professional and condescending at the same time, that no observer petition had ever successfully reversed a Category 3 designation. I thanked them for the information. I had 30 days to build the most important argument in the history of my species. Historias helped me, and I want to say clearly that she did so at real cost to herself. There were Keth delegates who noticed the amount of time she was spending with me and made their opinions known. She told me about it once, briefly, and then never mentioned it again. She was the kind of person who decided what she thought was right and then simply continued in that direction, regardless of the friction. I found that quality extraordinarily familiar. My argument could not be about military capability. Earth had significant defensive technology, but nothing that would impress a council that had member civilizations operating on stellar scales. It could not be about economic output or cultural achievement or any of the standard metrics the Council used to evaluate civilizational stability, because on every one of those metrics we would look exactly as young and incomplete as we were. The argument had to be about something the Council was not measuring. I started with the data. Every civilization in the Council's historical records that had achieved spaceflight, made first contact, and survived long enough to join. I looked at their developmental curves. I mapped their response times to crisis events, plagues, resource failures, environmental collapse, internal conflicts, contact with hostile species. I looked at how long they took to adapt, to change course, to rebuild after damage. And then I looked at Earth. The comparison was not flattering in the conventional sense. Our history was not clean, it was not organized, it was full of catastrophic decisions and avoidable disasters and conflicts that should never have happened. We had come close to destroying ourselves in ways both dramatic and quiet, through sudden crises and through slow accumulated failures alike. But we had never stopped adapting. Every single crisis in our recorded history had produced a response, not always the right response, not always a fast enough response, but a response. We changed laws, changed systems, changed how we produced energy and how we grew food and how we organized our cities and how we talked to each other. We did not have a period of stability the way the Velhari did. We had never been stable. What we had instead was a continuous, sometimes agonizing process of becoming something different from what we had been the year before. I mapped the response curves of the species the Council had classified as stable. I put them next to ours. The stable species had slower adaptation rates, not because they were less intelligent, because they had reached a point where the pressure to change had decreased. They had solved enough problems, controlled enough variables, that the urgency which drives genuine transformation had faded. The Velhari had not had a species-level crisis in 3,000 years. They were, by every conventional measure, enormously successful. They were also, I was increasingly convinced, no longer capable of handling something genuinely new. The species the Council had lost, the ones that had collapsed, the ones that no longer had names, they shared a trait that was not immediately obvious in the data. They had all been stable, very stable for a long time, and when the thing finally came that their stability could not handle, they had not been able to change fast enough to survive it. We were not stable. We had never been stable. We might from a distance look like chaos, but chaos in a changing universe has a specific advantage over order. It does not need to be surprised to move. I wrote the speech, I rewrote it, I cut sections and added others and read it aloud in my quarters at night with only the distant light of unfamiliar stars coming through the window. I tried to imagine 44 civilizations listening to it. I tried to imagine what would reach them and what would not. SS Sitica listened to an early version and told me it was too academic. She said, "You are explaining humanity to beings who have already decided what humanity is. You need to make them feel something first." I said, "What should they feel?" She thought for a moment, then she said, "Uncertain. You want them to feel uncertain because the argument you are making is that they have made a category error, and the only way to receive a category error is to first experience the category not working." I thought about that for a long time. I revised the speech again. There was one night about 2 weeks before the hearing when I sat down on the floor of my quarters because I could not manage the chair, not because I was afraid exactly, because the weight of what I was carrying had become suddenly very real. 10 billion people who did not know this was happening, a history that stretched back across thousands of years of survival against things that should have destroyed us, a species that had pulled itself from the bottom of a gravity well with sheer persistence and was now sitting in a chair designed for a different kind of being at the edge of a galaxy that had already decided what we were. I sat there for a while. I thought about my grandmother, who had grown up during a time when the city she lived in did not have reliable electricity, and who had lived to see the first human step Onto another planet, I thought about all the people between her world and mine, who had pushed and refused and rebuilt, and refused again. The unnamed ones whose names never made it into any official record, the ones who kept going. Anyway, I stood up, I went back to the desk. The speech was not perfect, it would never be perfect, but it was true and it was human, and I was going to stand in front of 44 civilizations and deliver it with everything I had. There was also the matter of the packet. I had read it 3 times now. I understood what it contained. I understood what it meant and what it would cost and what it could not be used. For if I wanted to prove the very thing I was trying to prove, but I also understood clearly and completely why it existed. Somewhere on Earth 22 years ago, a group of people had sat in a room and said, "We do not know what we will find out there, but we will be ready for whatever it is." They had built something quiet and careful and extraordinary, and they had never told anyone about it because that was not the kind of thing you advertised. That was the kind of thing you carried and hoped you never had to show. I was going to show it, not in the way they might expect, not as a threat but as a demonstration, as evidence, as the clearest possible proof of the exact argument I was making. I put the device from the packet on the desk in front of me and looked at it for a moment. Then I put it in my coat pocket and went to sleep. The hearing was in 14 days. I was ready. Part 4. One human presses a button. The chamber was the largest I had seen. Every session I had attended before had used the standard assembly configuration, which held the 44 voting delegations and a handful of observer seats at the back. For the hearing of reconsideration, the configuration had been expanded. Additional seating had been added along the perimeter walls for advisory staff and secondary delegates. The observer section had been enlarged because apparently the other observer delegations had requested to attend. The 2 grayscaled beings from Tesh were there when I arrived. The small, color-changing creature from the outer rim had come as well. They nodded at me. When I walked in, I nodded back. SS Sitica was in her assigned Cath delegation seat, which placed her in the middle tier of the chamber floor. She did not look at me when I entered. We had agreed the night before that she should not appear connected to my position. She had argued with me about it for 20 minutes, then she had agreed, because she understood strategy even when it cost her something. I was directed to the presentation position. It was a raised circular platform near the center of the chamber. Floor elevated perhaps 60 cm above ground level. The podium was designed for a Velhari, tall, angular, clearly not built for a human being. I stood beside it rather than behind it. The earpieces throughout the chamber crackled softly as the translation system synchronized. Rixville called the session to order. He was brief and precise, as he always was. He stated the nature of the proceeding. He noted for the formal record that no observer petition had previously succeeded in reviewing a Category 3 designation. He said this without visible emotion. I thought, watching him, that he was not saying it to discourage me. He was saying it because the record required it and because he was the kind of being who did not omit things from the record. The floor was given to me. I had 45 minutes. I began without notes. I said, I want to start with something that happened on Earth about 400 years ago. A woman named Elena March, who was a physician working during a period of severe resource scarcity, developed a method for filtering contaminated water using materials that could be assembled from garbage. She had no laboratory. She had no funding. The area she was working in had lost most of its infrastructure. She developed the method anyway from first principles, using what was available in the middle of a situation that should have been impossible to solve. Her method is still in use in modified form today. I paused. I said, I'm not telling you that story because it is remarkable. And GT snorts. And GT, I am telling you because on Earth it is not remarkable, it is ordinary. Our history is full of people who solved problems that should not have been solvable with the resources that should not have been sufficient under conditions that should not have permitted solutions. This is not a boast, it is a data point. And I would like to spend the next 40 minutes showing you what that data point means when you map it against the full civilizational record of this council. I spoke about adaptive velocity. I defined it precisely, and then I demonstrated it with numbers. I pulled the developmental curves of every council member species from their official historical filings, and I showed them on the chamber's display system, which I had been permitted to use as part of the hearing protocol. I showed the response to crisis timelines. I showed the adaptation rates. I showed the correlation, quiet and clear and undeniable, between long periods of stability and decreasing capacity to respond to genuinely novel threats. I showed them the collapse records, the species that were no longer here. I did not use names because most of them no longer had names. I used the council's own codes. I showed that in every case, the collapse had been preceded by a long period of exactly the kind of stability that the council valued and protected, and now wanted to impose on Earth. I said, I am not arguing that stability is bad. I am arguing that you are measuring the wrong thing. You are measuring our rate of change and calling it instability. What I am showing you is that our rate of change is precisely the trait that allowed us to survive events that should have ended us, and I am asking you to consider whether a galaxy that has lost as many civilizations as this one has might benefit from at least one member that still knows how to change. I talked about a leaner marching again. I talked about a man named Oliver Gray, who had rebuilt an entire agricultural system from theoretical principles after a climate event destroyed the existing one. I talked about a teenager named Cora Bell, who had identified the mathematical error in the early faster-than-light models that had been causing failures simply because she had not been taught that the error was not supposed to exist. Ordinary people solving impossible problems not because they were exceptional, because the culture that produced them refused to believe that the problem could not be solved. I said, you have been watching us for a long time. I understand why we look dangerous from a distance. We move fast. We change quickly. We do not always move in directions that appear organized or planned. But I would ask you to consider the possibility that what looks like instability from 6,000 years of altitude looks very different from the inside. From the inside, it looks like survival. It looks like the only way we know how to live. I was at 38 minutes. The chamber was very quiet. not the silence of disengagement, the silence of attention. And then Ricksville spoke. He did not wait for me to finish. That was within his procedural authority as session chair, and the fact that he used it told me something about the state of the room. He said the argument presented is emotionally compelling. However, the analytical question before this council is not whether humanity is capable. The question is whether the risk profile associated with unchecked development at this velocity justifies protective intervention. And on that question, Dr. Ase, your own history is the evidence against you. A species that has come as close to self-destruction as yours is precisely the kind of variable this council is designed to manage. Silence. I looked at him, I took a breath. I said, you are right. I let that sit for a moment. I said, you are right that our history contains serious failures. I am not standing here to tell you we are perfect. I'm standing here to tell you that what you call risk, we call honesty. We know what we are. We know how close we have come. We do not hide that history or sanitize it or pretend the failures did not happen. We carry them and we move forward anyway, and we change because of them. And I want to show you one more thing before I ask for your vote. I reached into my coat pocket. I took out the device. It was small, matte black, slightly larger than a thumb drive with a single recessed button on its face. I set it on the presentation surface in front of me. The chamber changed. I felt it change. The way you feel a room change when everyone in it suddenly becomes very alert. The Keth delegate nearest to the front shifted in his seat. The Duran cloud at the far end of the chamber compressed very slightly, the way they did when processing something unexpected. Ricksville's crystalline structure caught the light differently. For just a moment, what I had come to recognize as the Velhari equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. I said, this device, when activated, broadcasts a signal to a network of 17 relay stations currently positioned throughout the sector. Those stations are in standby mode. When I press this button, they wake up. They then transmit simultaneously complete data package to the home systems of every council member species. Not their ships here, not their delegates in this room, their home systems. The package is encrypted, self-replicating, and distributed in a way that makes it impossible to delete or intercept after transmission. It contains a full record of this hearing. It contains the complete record of every closed session in which Earth was discussed, every vote, every plan, every private communication logged through the official council relay system that concerns our classification, disseminated directly to the populations of every civilization in this sector. Outside this council's communication controls within approximately 4 minutes, not one being in the chamber made a sound. I said, I am not going to press it. I picked it up and put it back in my coat pocket. I said, I am not going to press it, because doing so would prove every fear you have about us. It would be coercive and destructive, and it would not accomplish anything except confirming that we cannot be trusted, and that is not what I came here to do. I said, but I want you to understand what this device represents. It represents 22 years of work by people on Earth who did not know exactly what threat they were preparing for, but who built a response anyway before we had observer status. before we knew what this council was or how it operated or whether we would ever sit in this room. Those people sat in a building on a planet that had not yet reached the stars, and they said, "We do not know what we will encounter, but we will not go unprepared." They built options, not weapons options. I said, "That is what I am showing you. That is the argument I have spent 40 minutes making, compressed into one object. We are not reckless. We are not unstable. We are a species that builds contingencies before it understands the threat, because we have learned the hard way many times over that the worst thing you can be when something new arrives is completely surprised." My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. I had not been certain it would be. I said, "I am asking you to vote again. Not because I am threatening you, not because I have leverage, but because I have shown you something true, and I believe you are beings who, when shown something true, are capable of changing what you think. That capacity, the capacity to update based on new information, is what I am asking you to recognize in us, because it is the same thing. It is exactly the same thing." I stepped back from the presentation position. I put my hands in my pockets and I looked at 44 civilizations, and I waited. Part 5: What comes after silence. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted them. Then Rixville called for a recess, and the chamber became the particular sound of 44 species processing something they had not expected to process today, and I walked back to the observer section and sat down and looked at my hands and noticed that they were completely steady, which surprised me, because inside I felt like something had broken loose from its anchoring and was floating somewhere slightly to the left of where it was supposed to be. SS Ithaca did not look at me from her delegate seat, but she shifted her position in a way that pointed her toward my section, which among the Keth was a formal gesture of solidarity that she knew I would recognize, and no one who was watching us would necessarily catch. I felt something tighten in my chest. The recess lasted 3 hours. I went to the common area outside the chamber and ate a small meal from the provisions I carried, and drank 2 cups of something hot that the dispensary produced when you requested coffee, and that was not quite coffee but was close enough. I sat at a table by myself. Few delegates from smaller species passed through and looked at me with varying degrees of open curiosity. I nodded at the ones who made eye contact. Most of them looked away quickly. One of the gray-scaled beings from Tesh came over and stood near my table. We did not share a common language. Translation protocols for Tesh were still being developed, and my earpiece produced static when they spoke. But this one looked at me for a long moment and made a gesture I did not know the meaning of, both hands placed flat against the front of its rib cage, held there for about 3 seconds, and then extended outward toward me. I did not know what it meant, but it felt like something. I placed my own hands against my chest and extended them back. The Tesh being made a sound I could not translate and walked away. I sat with that for a while. I thought about the device in my pocket. I thought about the people who had built it. I did not know their names. They had worked in a classified program under a government agency that no longer existed in its original form, a project that had been started by one administrator and quietly maintained by 3 successive ones over 22 years. never discussed in any public forum, funded through budget lines with innocuous labels. They had been preparing for something they could not name. Preparing anyway, I thought about the kind of faith that required faith not in a specific outcome, but in the simple premise that preparation was always worth doing. I thought about my grandmother again. She had told me once when I was about 12 years old that the most important thing a person could learn was how to stay in a room when the room became uncomfortable, not to enjoy the discomfort, not to pretend it was not there, just to stay. She had a way of explaining things that made them sound obvious after the fact, as though the wisdom had always been available and was simply waiting for you to be ready to hear it. I had stayed in the room. The second half of the recess was announced over the station's communication system, and I walked back to the chamber. The full council went into closed deliberation at the end of the session. All 44 species. I was told it lasted 19 hours. I slept for a portion of that time fitfully in my quarters. I woke up several times thinking I had heard something, and each time the room was quiet and the stars outside the window were unchanged, and the device was still in my coat pocket, which I had left folded on the chair by the bed. I did not know how the vote would go. I had made the best argument I knew how to make. I had shown them the most honest version of what we were. I had given them both the data and the demonstration, and I had trusted them to look at both. That was all I could do. The rest was theirs. Ricksville came to my quarters before the announcement. It was early in what the station system designated as morning, and I had been awake for an hour. I heard the door signal and answered it. He stood in the corridor, very tall, his crystalline body catching the corridor light at angles that made him look like a slowly shifting window. He did not ask to come in. We stood in the doorway. He said, "The relay network, when was it built?" I said the first stations were placed 22 years ago. The network was completed 12 years later. The most recent maintenance run was 4 years ago. He said, "You built it before you knew what you might need it for." I said, "Yes." He said, "Before you knew this council existed." I said, "We knew there was something out there. We did not know what shape it would take." He was quiet for a moment. I watched the light move through him. He said, "We have never done that in 6,000 years of spacefaring history. We have never built a contingency for a threat we could not yet name. We have always waited until we understood the shape of a problem before we addressed it." I said, "We cannot afford to wait." He said, "No, I am beginning to understand that you cannot." Another silence. Something in the light around him changed in a way I had not seen before, something quieter. He said, "The argument you made yesterday is not the argument I expected you to make." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Defiance, appeals to sovereignty, emotional statements about the right of species to self-determination. Those arguments have been made before on various occasions, and they have never succeeded because they are arguments about what a species wants, not about what it is." I said, "We wanted you to understand what we are." He said, "I know, that is what surprised me. There is a difference between wanting to be free of restriction and wanting to be understood. The first is self-interest, the second is something Elsie. He did not say what the second was. I did not ask. I thought I understood. He said, I cannot tell you the result before it is announced, but I wanted to speak with you before the session. I said, I appreciate that. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, your grandmother, the one you mentioned in the speech. I had mentioned her only briefly in a single sentence near the end. I had not expected anyone to notice. He said, she sounds like she was a person worth knowing. I said, she was the best person I have ever known. He nodded, which was not a Vilhari gesture but one he had adopted from years of working with other species, and walked back down the corridor. I closed the door and stood in my quarters for a moment and thought, he is going to vote for us. I did not know why I was certain. I was certain anyway. The announcement came 2 hours later. The Category 3 designation for Earth was suspended pending a full review of classification criteria to be conducted. Over the following 18 months, the review would examine not only Earth's case but the standards by which the Council assessed all developing civilizations. The vote to suspend was 31 in favor, 9 against, 4 abstentions. 31. I read the number 3 times. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I picked up my communication device and held it for a while before I started recording the message for Earth. I did not try to be eloquent. I had used most of my eloquence the day before, and what was left was something simpler and more tired and maybe more honest. I said, this is Dr. Yora Asai. Category 3 designation has been suspended. We have 18 months before a full review, and there is a great deal of work to be done before that review happens, and I am not going to pretend that 31 to 9 is the same as unanimity, because it is not. There are 9 species on this council who are still afraid of us, and that matters, and we should take it seriously. I paused. I said, but we bought ourselves time, and everything that comes next is going to depend on what we do with it. I wanted you to know that the people who built the relay network, whoever they were, they are the reason we are here. The argument was mine. The preparation was theirs. Please find out their names if you can. I stopped the recording. I looked at the stars. Esidica found me an hour later. She came to my quarters and sat beside me, and we were both quiet for a while, in the way that people are quiet when something large has just passed through the room, and the air is still settling. She said, you knew he would vote for you. I said, I thought he might. She said, how? I said, because I told him the truth about what we are, including the parts that were not flattering, and because I think he has been waiting for a very long time for something that surprised him. She considered that. Then she said, the other Keth delegates are calling it a procedural anomaly. They are saying the suspension is temporary, and the eventual review will likely reimpose the designation with modifications. I said, they might be right. She said, does that not concern you? I said, it concerns me very much, but I also know that 18 months ago, no one on Earth knew this council existed. 12 months ago, I had never been in space. And yesterday, a human being stood in front of 44 civilizations, and the vote was 31 to 9. Things change, that is what we do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know they are all at least a little afraid of you now. I looked at the window, at the stars. Beyond it, at the vast and indifferent dark that we had pushed ourselves into, because we could not stay still and could not stop reaching and could not, except that the distance was too great. I thought about a leaner march in her water filter. I thought about Oliver Gray rebuilding an agricultural system from first principles. I thought about Cora Bell finding the error that nobody else had known to look for. I thought about the unnamed people in a government building 22 years ago, deciding to prepare for something they could not name. I thought about my grandmother placing her hands against her chest in a small house in Accra and telling a 12-year-old girl that the most important thing was to stay in the room. I said, good, they should be, not because we will hurt them, but because we are not going to stop. We have never stopped, and now they know it. The next morning, when I arrived at the chamber for the regular session, something had changed. There was a new seat on the main floor, not in the observer gallery at the back. On the floor itself, along the left perimeter in the section where the smaller member delegation sat, it was a standard human height chair. Beside it, on a small stand, was Earth's flag, the one I had placed on my lapel every day since arriving. Someone had reproduced it at a larger scale cleanly and positioned it with care. It was not a voting seat. There was a small placard that read, "Observing Delegate Earth Provisional Standing." The word provisional was doing a great deal of work, and I did not pretend otherwise. But it was on the floor. I walked to it. I sat down. The seat was the right height. I looked out at the chamber from a place I had not been permitted to sit before, and the chamber looked different from here, not smaller, not less intimidating, but different in the particular way that things look different when you are no longer being kept at a distance from them. SSITICA filed in with the Caith delegation and took her seat. She did not look at me, but I saw the slight shift in her posture that I had learned to read, and I thought, she sees it. Ricksville called the session to order. The 462nd session of the Galactic Council continued. I took out my notes. I started writing. We were not done. We were nowhere near done. The review would come, and it would be difficult, and 9 species out of 44 were still hoping we would be managed and restricted and kept small and careful. The galaxy was larger than I could hold in my mind all at once, and we were still in the scale of it, very new. But we were in the room. We were in the room, and we were not going anywhere, and every species in this chamber now knew with absolute clarity that if you gave humanity problem without a solution and no resources and no time, and told us it was impossible, what you would get back was not an apology. What you would get back was a leaner march, inventing a water filter out of garbage. What you would get back was a relay network built 22 years before anyone knew it would be needed. What you would get back was one woman standing at a podium built for a different kind of being, putting a small black device on the surface in front of her and then putting it back in her pocket. The universe had mocked us. It had decided from a distance what we were. We had simply continued being it anyway. And that in the end had been more than enough.